I knew something was wrong the second I saw the orange fencing from the end of my driveway. Out where I live, bright orange usually means one of two things. Somebody hit a gas line, or somebody's fixing to do something they got no business doing. I remember just sitting there in my truck for a second, engine still running, coffee cooling off in the cup holder while I stared across my pasture thinking, no way, no damn way. But the closer I drove, the worse it got. Stacks of concrete bags, pallets of brick, steel pipe, rebar tied up in bundles thick as telephone poles, all of it sitting right in the middle of my family's land like somebody had dropped a construction site out of the sky overnight. And right there by the gate, zip-tied to a wooden stake like it belonged there, was a laminated sign that said, "Temporary material storage. Authorized personnel only." Temporary. That word ended up costing those people a whole lot of money. Now, for this to make sense, you gotta understand something about that land. My place sits just outside a town called Belmere, Tennessee. Not much there except old farms, a feed store, 2 churches that secretly hate each other, and 1 gas station where everybody still talks like high school ended last week. My grandfather bought those 5 acres after Vietnam with money he saved fixing diesel engines. Never sold an inch of it. My dad used to say land was the only thing left in America they weren't making more of. And he treated that property almost like another member of the family. I grew up cutting grass out there, digging fence posts in the summer heat, learning how to drive an old Ford tractor before I was even tall enough to reach the clutch proper. So if people ask why I got so worked up over a little storage problem, that's why. It wasn't storage, it was disrespect. The trouble started about a year after the Hollow Creek Estates development moved in next door. Big fancy HOA neighborhood, fake stone entrances, matching mailboxes, those big gray houses where every porch got the same 4 rocking chairs from the same catalog. Folks moved in from Nashville mostly, some from Atlanta, acting like country living was a hobby you could buy on weekends. At first, we mostly stayed out of each other's way. I'd wave if I saw somebody walking dogs near the property line. They'd wave back awkwardly like they were scared dirt might get on them. Fine by me. Then the HOA board changed. This woman named Cynthia Vale took over as president. And suddenly everybody in that neighborhood started acting like they owned the whole county. Complaints about my tractor noise. Complaints about my burn barrel smoke. One time somebody actually emailed the county because my nephew parked an old fishing boat beside the barn for 2 weeks. They lost their minds over that boat like it was radioactive. Meanwhile, these people were cutting trees down, blasting rock for foundations, running construction crews 6 days a week from sunrise to dark. Still, I kept my mouth shut. Mostly because my dad taught me something years ago. Never wrestle pigs unless you got time to smell like one afterward. But then came that Saturday morning. I got out of the truck and walked straight over to the sign. The grass underneath those pallets was already torn to mud from heavy equipment tires. Deep ruts everywhere. Somebody had even cut my chain off the back access gate to get trucks in easier. That part hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just careless anymore. They knew this wasn't theirs. So I called the number on the sign. Guy answers with that rushed, annoyed voice contractors always got. Like every phone call costs them personally. "Yeah?" I said, "This is Wade Lawson. You got about 30,000 pounds of construction materials sitting on my property." Little silence. Then he goes, "Oh, right, yeah. We're with Hollow Creek's clubhouse expansion project. We just needed temporary staging space for a few weeks." Like he was explaining a weather delay. I said, "You didn't ask permission." And this man actually laughed. Not nervous laughing either. Condescending laughing. Then he says, "Sir, it's not hurting anything." I still remember the way my grip tightened around that phone. Not hurting anything. My grandfather's pasture looked like the loading dock behind a Home Depot. And this guy was telling me not to worry about it. I told him he had until sundown to remove every piece of it. He sighed real loud into the phone and said, "Look, buddy, these schedules are tight. We'll get to it when we can." Buddy. That was the exact moment something shifted in me, because it suddenly became clear these people didn't think I was a landowner. They thought I was background scenery, just some old local they could step over while they built their precious little clubhouse. And standing there in the mud, staring at tire tracks carved across my grandfather's field, I decided if they wanted to turn my property into a storage yard so badly, then I was going to give them one they'd never forget. That night I didn't sleep much. I sat out on the porch with a cheap bourbon and watched floodlights glowing over at Hollow Creek Estates while crickets screamed across the pasture. And the more I thought about that phone call, the madder I got. Not explosive mad, worse than that. Calm mad. The kind where your brain starts organizing things real quiet. Around midnight, my old friend Leon texted me asking if I was still coming fishing Sunday morning. I replied with one sentence. You still got access to that forklift? 5 minutes later, my phone rang. Leon had worked at the quarry outside Belmere for almost 20 years. Built like an old oak tree and about twice as stubborn. Soon as I explained what happened, he let out this long whistle and said, "Man, rich folks finally poked the wrong farmer." I said, "You busy tomorrow night?" He laughed immediately. Absolutely not. The third member of our little operation ended up being my cousin Ray, mostly because Ray never turned down anything that sounded illegal adjacent. Ray hauled scrap metal for a living and owned this rusty flatbed truck that rattled so hard going downhill it sounded like loose cookware in a tornado. When I told him the plan, there was dead silence for about 3 seconds before he said, "Hold on, you're telling me they illegally dumped materials on your land and you want to move their own stuff deeper onto your own property?" "Yep. And technically they can't touch it without trespassing again." "Yep." Another pause. Then all I heard was him cackling. Around 1:30 the next morning, we got started. Now, before anybody starts clutching pearls in the comments, let me say this. We didn't steal a single thing. Didn't damage it either. We moved every pallet carefully. Every bundle strapped down proper. Honestly, we treated their supplies better than they treated my land. Moon was bright enough you barely needed headlights. Leon brought the forklift over on a trailer, while Ray backed the flatbed through the rear pasture gate. We worked mostly in silence at first. The kind of silence that comes when 3 grown men know they're doing something incredibly stupid, but also deeply satisfying. Forklift beeping softly. Chains rattling. Diesel engines idling low. Pallet by pallet, we started relocating Hollow Creek's little temporary storage area, about 200 yards deeper into the property where the pasture dipped down near an old abandoned cattle pen my grandfather used back in the 70s. And that's when the idea got better. See? Earlier that evening while pacing around my barn, I noticed a pile of old barbed wire fencing stacked behind the shed, rusted all to hell, tangled like steel spaghetti. Most people would have hauled it off years ago. My dad kept saying he might reuse it someday. Well, someday finally arrived. I looked at Leon and said, "You know what'd really send these people into orbit?" He already knew. That grin spread across his face slow as sunrise. "Oh, we are absolutely building a fence." So now it wasn't just moving materials anymore. Now we were creating art. For the next 4 hours, we built what can only be described as the angriest junkyard in Middle Tennessee. We stacked old tractor tires around the perimeter like barricades, strung rusted barbed wire between T-posts, hauled over busted feed troughs, cracked fence panels, even an old washing machine Ray found behind my barn that hadn't worked since Bush was president, the first Bush. And dead center, in the middle of all that nonsense, I planted a giant plywood sign. Took me 3 tries to get the letter straight because I'd already had too much bourbon by then, but eventually in huge red spray paint it read, "Hey Treblo Crete Temp Storage, Corchancy of Trees Passing." Leon laughed so hard he had to sit down on a tire. By sunrise the whole thing looked less like a construction site and more like a post-apocalyptic scrapyard run by extremely petty farmers. And honestly, it was beautiful. I was back on my porch drinking coffee around 8 when the first HOA truck rolled up. I'll never forget that moment. Guy slows down near the gate, pauses, then just slams on the brakes. Even from that far away, I could see his head jerking around trying to process what he was looking at. About 30 seconds later, 2 more trucks showed up. Then a white SUV with the Hollow Creek logo on the side. Doors started flying open. Men in hard hats pointing everywhere. One guy actually climbed onto the hood of a truck trying to see over the fencing. Then came the honking, long angry blasts echoing across the pasture. Ray, who was sitting beside me eating sausage biscuits, goes, "Sounds like mating season." I nearly choked laughing. About 10 minutes later, Mr. It's Not Hurting Anything himself came storming up my driveway. Tall guy, expensive boots too clean to have ever seen actual labor, sunglasses on even though it was cloudy. He marched right up to my porch like he owned the place. "You think this is funny?" he snapped. I took a sip of coffee first. "Little bit." His face turned red instantly. "You moved private construction materials." "No," I said calmly. "I relocated abandoned property that was illegally stored on my land. That's not how this works." I pointed toward the pasture. "Actually, looks like that's exactly how it worked." Leon made this choking sound behind me, trying not to laugh again. The project manager ignored him and stepped closer. You need to remove that fencing immediately. I said, can't. Why not? Because then somebody might trespass. That landed exactly how I hoped it would. He just stared at me for a second, jaw twitching. See? The problem for him was simple. County survey markers clearly showed where my property line sat. And because they'd already cut my chain and entered without permission once, the sheriff's department was suddenly very interested in the situation. In fact, Sheriff Tom Blevins was already parked down the road watching the whole circus unfold from inside his cruiser. Mostly because Tom and my dad used to hunt together years ago, and he personally couldn't stand the Hollow Creek HOA after they tried filing noise complaints against the high school football stadium. The project manager finally noticed the cruiser. That's when his confidence cracked a little. He lowered his voice and tried a different approach. Look, Mr. Lawson, we can work this out. Funny how fast Buddy turned into Mr. Lawson. I leaned back in my chair and said, can we? He glanced toward the Junkyard fortress again, probably calculating how much money was sitting trapped behind rusty wire and tractor tires. Then he said the dumbest possible thing. You've embarrassed a lot of important people here. And there it was. Not apology, not accountability, embarrassment. Because that's all this had ever been to folks like them. They genuinely believed rules were flexible as long as the inconvenience landed on somebody poorer, older, or quieter than them. I looked him dead in the eye and said, good. For a second, I honestly thought he might swing at me. Instead, he ripped his sunglasses off and hissed, "We have any idea how much this delay is costing us?" And before I could answer, Ray spoke up from the porch swing, probably less than respecting property lines. Dead silence. Then somewhere down in the pasture, one of the workers accidentally backed a golf cart into the tire barricade trying to inspect the fencing. The whole thing tipped sideways into a mud ditch. I swear to God. Leon laughed so hard coffee came out his nose. By Monday morning, the whole county knew about it. That's the thing about small towns. You can keep a secret, or you can do something funny, but you usually can't do both. By sunrise, folks were already posting blurry pictures of my Junkyard fortress on Facebook. Somebody added dramatic music to drone footage. Somebody else started calling it Fort Lawson. Even the cashier at Miller's feed store grinned when I walked in and said, "Heard you started your own gated community." Meanwhile, over at Hollow Creek Estates, things were apparently falling apart fast. Turns out the materials trapped on my property weren't just random extras. They were scheduled for a major clubhouse expansion the HOA board had been bragging about for months. Outdoor kitchen, luxury pool deck, pickleball courts, all the rich people survival essentials. The contractors were booked tight. Concrete crews had timelines. Permits had expiration windows. Every day those supplies sat behind my fencing burned money, and because the sheriff's office documented the original trespassing complaint, the HOA lawyers couldn't exactly storm onto my land acting righteous without opening themselves up to a lawsuit, so they stalled. Then they panicked. Then they started trying to negotiate. Tuesday afternoon, Cynthia Vale herself came to my house. Now, Cynthia was the kind of woman who smiled with only her mouth. Perfect hair, pearl earrings, sunglasses bigger than common sense. She walked up my driveway like she was approaching a hostage exchange. I stayed on the porch. She stayed in the yard, probably scared the dirt might touch her shoes. "Mr. Lawson," she said, all polished and careful. "Surely we can resolve this like adults." I almost laughed right there because people only say like adults when they know they're wrong. She started explaining how the storage situation had been a miscommunication and how nobody intended disrespect and how the development had brought value to the surrounding area. That last part really got me. Brought value. My grandfather raised 3 kids on that land before her neighborhood even existed. But somehow now my property only mattered because their subdivision was nearby. I let her talk for a while because honestly it was fascinating watching somebody try to wrap entitlement in polite language. Finally I asked, "Did anybody ask permission before cutting my lock off?" That stopped her cold, little twitch in her jaw. "No," she admitted quietly. "And if I'd done that to your neighborhood gate?" Silence. Then she said, "This has become unnecessarily hostile." That one almost impressed me. Like somehow my reaction was the problem, not the trespassing. I leaned forward in my chair and said, "Cynthia, your people treated my property like empty space because you figured nobody out here would push back. That's what this is really about." For the first time since she arrived, the mask slipped a little. "You could have handled this differently too," she snapped. And there it was. Not we were wrong. Just anger that somebody lower on the ladder had refused to stay quiet. The crazy part is, for a second, I actually thought about backing down. I did. My dad always believed feuds between neighbors poisoned everybody eventually. And standing there looking across the pasture at all that ridiculous fencing and rusty junk, part of me wondered if maybe I'd crossed from justified into petty. Then Cynthia glanced past me toward my barn and said, "Honestly, this whole property is kind of an eyesore anyway." That settled it. Conversation over. I stood up slowly, walked to the porch steps, and pointed toward the road. "You can leave now." Her face tightened. "Excuse me, you heard me. This isn't finished." I nodded once. "No, ma'am, it is." She stared at me another few seconds like she couldn't believe someone had spoken to her that way, then finally turned around and marched back to her SUV. And right before she opened the door, she looked over at the junkyard corner one last time. I think that's when it finally hit her. They weren't getting those materials back anytime soon. Within 2 weeks, the contractors ordered replacement supplies. Cost the HOA a fortune, from what I heard. Special emergency meetings got called. HOA dues went up. Homeowners started fighting with the board. Some blamed Cynthia. Some blamed the contractors. One guy supposedly threatened legal action because the delayed clubhouse lowered community prestige, which might be the funniest phrase I've ever heard in my life. As for the original materials, still sitting right where we moved them. Eventually, the county got involved and worked out a legal process for the HOA to retrieve everything properly. But by then, the damage was done. Financially, politically, socially. Hollow Creek never fully recovered from becoming the laughingstock of Belmere. Me? Well, life mostly went back to normal. I still mow that pasture every Sunday evening. Still sit on the same porch my dad built 30 years ago. Still drink coffee watching deer move through the tree line at sunrise. But down near the south fence line, there's still one little section I never cleaned up completely. Couple old tractor tires. A few rusted posts. Part of that crooked plywood sign fading in the rain. Not because I need the reminder, because they do. Every now and then, somebody from Hollow Creek drives by slower than normal, usually when they've got guests visiting. And I catch people staring at that old junkyard corner like it's some kind of local legend. Maybe it is, because around here people still tell the story about the time a bunch of wealthy HOA folks tried turning a farmer's pasture into temporary storage and accidentally built the most expensive embarrassment in county history. Now, personally, I think everybody involved learned something. They learned property lines matter. I learned I'm apparently much pettier than I thought. And Sheriff Blevins learned never to underestimate bored rednecks with access to heavy equipment. But I'm curious what you think. If somebody dumped thousands of dollars of material on your land without permission, would you have handled it differently? Or would you have fenced the whole mess in too? Let me know down in the comments, because depending on who you ask around Belmere, I'm either the last guy standing up for property rights or the reason the HOA president drinks wine before noon now.